The views expressed on the Nova Society are those of the participants and do not reflect the view of any institution any participant is associated with. We'd like to welcome everyone back to the Nova Society, and today our panel will be having a discussion about the previous primary in Iowa, the upcoming primary in New Hampshire. We actually have someone who lives in New Hampshire that can give us a little bit of an insight into the mindset of the New Hampshire primary voter. We'll also be talking about the mindset of the entire country. How are we moving toward fascism? Are we moving toward fascism? And is this a trend that we should be concerned about? Finally, we'll talk about Trump and what his strategy is, if there actually is a strategy, to be able to suck in the voters to believe the narrative that he is presenting. So let's listen in. So in the news this week, Trump wins Iowa.
Yeah, he did.
But as Scott said, very, very low turnout.
Plus, many of the individuals who, like the other Republicans or whatever, said that they would not vote Republican or undecideds or whatever they were. They didn't indicate they would vote for Biden. Right.
Yeah, that was an interesting poll. Yep, that was an interesting poll.
It was very interesting. And now we've got New Hampshire.
New Hampshire's next.
Yep, New Hampshire next.
You manifested me.
We were actually talking about New Hampshire before you came on.
Yeah,
we were discussing the polls in New Hampshire. Hopefully that the New Hampshireites are not as crazy as those in Iowa. But who knows?
I would not bet on it. So it's going to be fun.
I don't know. What troubles me so much is that, like, the individuals apparently who believe in Trump, like he's some sort of messiah, they believe everything that he says. Well, I have to be in court, so I can't be on the campaign trail. No, he doesn't have to be in court. He doesn't need to be at this trial in the civil New York state case. He doesn't have to be there at all. He chose to be there, but he's going to say, well, I have to be there, so I can't be, and make himself out to be a victim. And everyone says, oh, and people who believe in this man are apparently incapable of hearing any words to the contrary, regardless of fact. And I've heard that called the backfire effect. It's Nyhan and Reifler. They did research on it and showed that the more facts a person shows in an effort to point out someone else's misunderstanding of reality, the more the other person is apt to resist reality. Apparently, I also heard that a number of Republicans, I don't know how many, in the first or the second impeachment trial would have voted to impeach, but were dissuaded from doing so by other Republicans by saying, well, think about your family's safety, think about your safety, but the larger picture, think about what happens to the nation and everyone else's safety if we don't impeach and we don't convict, is being left out of the picture. And now here we are again in deeper peril as a nation. I understand it's a cult, and I understand the blinkers that people have on. It's just the fact that we're still here after all this time. And now that we have the situation seems to have its own momentum. I don't know. I find myself becoming more alarmed rather than less alarmed. So I'd like to know what everybody else thinks.
Okay. Well,
there's a lot to unpack there, Scott.
It really is. I'll say this. We voted him out once before. He's 7 million votes, 3 million into 2016. And we know that the turnout was lower in that election. The Democrats are smart enough to put things like referendums on ballots. to drive people to the polls in November. And I think that the coalition that has abandoned Biden currently will be back with him the closer that we get to the election, and that the turnout will be great, and we'll reject him once again. We'll have to go through the whole it's rigged. That'll start this summer and continue all fall right into November and then beyond. That the whole thing is rigged. He does it every time he loses, and that and that like the people are rejecting him, and the turnout in Iowa was low enough, and enough people voted against him to give you some hope that people are beginning to get tired of his act, and that more and more people are abandoning him. The base, is never going to do that. They're always going to be there for him. They will turn out. They would walk on their knees over ice and uncooked rice to get to the polls to support him. There's nothing you can do about that except just hope that it's a relatively small number, which it seems to be, and that they're not going to hold sway. The bigger problem that I think we face right now that is scary is what they're going to do when they lose, and then what is Vladimir Putin going to do in the run-up to the election that he's waiting for right now. Right? His strategy in Ukraine right now is to hold on until Trump can be elected. He's going to do everything in his power to make sure that happens. And that means that we're going to see a lot of deep fakes, and we're going to see a lot of shenanigans. We're going to see voters targeted in very specific ways, the way they were in the 2016 election, which took us by surprise. Nobody knew what Cambridge Analytica was back then. Nobody knew what they were up to, how many messages they could send out, how they could finally target people who were, compelled to stay home in that election rather than go out and vote. And we know how close it was. So those are the things that are scary. The violence that is going to continue, threats, swatting, and the constant drumbeat of racism and misogyny and all kinds of egregious things that he kind of represents, and people, for whatever reason, embrace. Those things will continue, but I think we'll get through it.
Yeah, Priscilla, you're our cultural anthropologist, sitting amongst all of these conflict people.
Mythologist.
Huh?
Mythologist.
Well, all right. Well, I mean, is this not like mythology?
Theoretical difference there.
Well, a little theoretical, but I mean, isn't this like I mean, when you think about it, theology is something that people believe without any true fact or any true, proof. We've done that for like centuries as human beings. How do you explain this?
Oh, Mark. I mean, the narrative has been in place for decades. Like, we are at another chapter of a long narrative that, whether you want to, take it back to the early 80s or if you want to take it back to the 70s, it's been a trajectory that the United States has been on for quite some time. And I don't know if, it's fair to say that this is a cause, but I would, definitely say there is some causality of a society in crisis since World War II, that we've, perpetuated this narrative of we have to find some way to be secure from this unknown enemy. Like, there's this thing called communism, this thing called terrorism, this thing called brown people, this thing called Russians. Like, we don't have a thing, so we're just making it this big, like, cultural moment, and we're creating a fear state that's like, okay, you're insecure because of this unknown terror. So here are all the things that you need to do, be secure. And by the way, these are the only people, are the only leaders who can get you to that point of security. The problem with that is it's an artificial narrative. It's creating this concept of security that is meant to be much more isolated and much more insulated than what a government can actually do. It's like people want the lockdown on their houses, and they want the government to provide that lockdown on their houses, but they don't want the government to do anything. So there's this like contradictory like assumption of what government can do versus what the reality of it happens to be. And I honestly don't see Donald Trump as another player, another chapter in this narrative, this spiraling descent into fascism that will either culminate in a fascist takeover of the United States or will culminate in a great awakening. The optimistic utopian in me wants to say we're going to have a great awakening, but the jaded millennial in me says, it's going to definitely be a descent into fascism before we get anywhere.
So, yeah, and you're in New Hampshire, and the question is you're next up after Iowa. What are you hearing up there?
I'm definitely trying not to hear anything, but
there's a lot of people like that, I've noticed.
Yeah, there's so I'm in my piece of New Hampshire is definitely very red. So New Hampshire over the last couple of elections has started trending purple. Historically, it was the red state in all of New England. And it's very odd to me the extent to which we're red, but it's because there's the part of New Hampshire that touches Massachusetts. That's the blue part of New Hampshire, and then the rest of it's red because you're up in the woods and you have no one to talk to, so you may as well be a survivalist. So we have a very interesting break here, and so my particular little pocket of New Hampshire is not isolated in the woods, but it is still a very red community. And honestly, the Trump posters never went down. So it's part of the conservative narrative that Trump was the president, Biden unfairly took it, let's go Brandon and all of that stuff. That narrative never stopped. What's been interesting is the voices that are trying to break in to the narrative in the middle of all of this. So I've been getting the election pamphlets for like a year now, hey, you're in a little Republican community, vote for this Republican candidate in next year's primaries. Not a registered Republican, so I don't know why they think I'm on their mailing list, but I'm getting these little posters, and there's definitely the narrative of, as Scott said, like the messianic image of Trump, but then there's also this is a very real threat to democracy narrative. We need to do better. Hey, Nikki Haley on this side, or anybody but Trump on that side. And so as we get closer to the primaries, the rhetoric is shifting in the direction of, well, if you put Trump up, it's going to be, Biden's going to win. And we've had the whole thing about, he's keeping Trump in court on purpose. It's the Democratic agenda. Like, no, that's not how it works, but sure. But then there's the, this is the candidate who is the only one who could beat Biden. So vote for this candidate during the primaries. And it gets very heated. And of course, it's Nikki Haley. Everyone's, if it's not Trump, it's Nikki up here. And so everyone's really heavily committed to the idea of, so one way or another, it's either going to be Trump or it's got to be someone who can beat Biden. It can't be there is no other Democratic candidate in the narrative anywhere at all. And even up here, I think Biden's not on the ticket. So he's a write-in for the primaries.
Yeah, actually, I don't think you guys are actually. Well, you're kind of having a primary, but I don't think it really counts for the Democrats. Yeah, a little bit of a primary. Yeah, so. My take on this is, and I have a great story about New Hampshire, Berlin, New Hampshire.
Oh, yes.
Which is way up there. That's up there in the survivalist place. My brother-in-laws and I went to my sister-in-law's wedding. We were so bad. Now, this was, granted, 40 years ago. We got escorted to the New York to the Vermont line by the state police and told never come back to New Hampshire. we had what we like to call a big time. We had a great time, but obviously up there, the survivalists, they didn't like our great time that we were having. So, yeah. That's why when I got invited to come up to the university for the thing, I was thinking, gee, am I allowed back into the state at this point in time? Maybe they've forgotten. Anyway, I think first of all, polls. The thing I'm going to say about polls are the polls today, as far as the national election is concerned, do not count. It's too far out, number one, and they are unreliable. They're always unreliable. When we get to, say, June, then you start paying attention to what the polls are going to say. I mean, that's almost historically the way it goes. My one concern is I do not believe that mathematically Trump can win the election as far as the popular vote. Unfortunately, as we all know, that doesn't matter in the United States. What matters is that electoral college. That is where, that's how he got in last time, the first time around. He lost by 3 million votes and he still got in. We've had presidents. It's happened 4 times, 4 or 5 in the history of presidencies where the guy that won the most votes isn't the guy that's in the office. So the electoral college for me is an issue. It is a problem. But it is the one thing that you're never going to see go away because Republicans know without the electoral college, it's going to be very difficult for them to win an election because they just don't carry the numbers that they have. Now, you make mention, I'm going to do a little bit of looking back. The problem with democracies, and we look at democracies all across, the history of humankind. At one point in time, if we look at the democracy, and I know a lot of people may have the argument, was Rome a democracy? It was a republic. It was still a republic. So were the Greeks. They were a republic. They all fall into, eventually, fascism. If you look at every single one of them, at some point in time, they fall into fascism. As a matter of fact, the only and you really can't even say this, they kind of were in it and they weren't with Great Britain, the British Empire. They weren't in it. Monarchy really isn't fascism. It's not really. But when you have a democracy, a republic like we have, for some reason, historically, they all eventually fall into some sort of a fascist regime. The Romans took 500 years to do it. 400, more arguably 400 years to do it, and then they were gone after like 500. We've only been around for 250, and we're already starting to go into it. So that is my concern, because democracy is hard work, plain and simple. It's hard work, and I think people just basically don't want to be engaged. How can you not want to vote? And then when you don't vote, complain about what happened. I mean, it's the most amazing thing. So I think we've got to look at this historically. I don't think, and I've said this to Brooke numerous times in an attempt to allay her fears, Trump will not win the election. He will not win the popular vote. My fear is that we have that ridiculous concept of the Electoral College, which is ruling by landmass. The Electoral College is basically ruling by landmass. There is no reason, if Houston, Texas was a state, they have more population than South Carolina. So, it's not by the people, it's by land. And that is something that has existed since our founding. And it's unfortunate, but it's something we all have to keep an eye on, is the math. I always talk about electoral math. What's the electoral math as it goes to the Electoral College? And I think that's one of the places where we sit.
One of the things that went wrong, I guess, and you would say in 2016, is that voters in 3 cities basically didn't come out and vote. And if they had come out to vote the way they had voted for Obama twice, then Hillary Clinton would probably still be the president.
So those 3 cities are Philadelphia, yes?
No, actually,
Detroit?
Harrisburg,
Okay.
Pennsylvania, Detroit, Michigan, and
Milwaukee?
Milwaukee.
Okay.
And if you look at the stats, those are the three places where voters stayed home in that 1 year, and you can see the dip in voter turnout there, where they came out strongly in 2020 and had previously. The fear now is that Biden doesn't have the attraction for black voters the way he did in 2020, and he's going to have to. I mean, Biden has a lot of work to do if he's going to continue this and keep it through. And I'm still somewhat hopeful, I guess. I'm not really sure that's even the word. that he will just hand off his delegates to a chosen successor, as I said last time on our call.
Yep.
and that will be how he finishes his political career. But he's gotta energize this coalition, and the economics. He's going to have a little tailwind there. I think people are going to be a lot happier with the economy. I think there's some signs that people already are happy with their economic situation. Hopefully, we can put these at least the Israel war behind us and be on our way to getting something actually done in the Middle East for the first time. I saw today, I don't know if everybody else saw this, that Mike Johnson has declared that nothing will be done on the border. He's reversing his position that he can make a deal for the border for Israel and for Ukraine. And now he's saying we're going to do nothing in the House. And that could lead to his ouster and some other things happening. You can expect right now a fairly good chance that the government will be shut down over the next couple of weeks, and that the House isn't willing to give any victories to Joe Biden that will help him get reelected, so that they're going to sit this one out. Republicans in the House are going to simply refuse to get anything done. After all this time of complaining that the border is open and nobody's doing anything, they're not going to make a deal for the border. And, I don't know how how the Biden administration is going to continue supporting Ukraine. I suppose he's going to have to try to explain to people all about Neville Chamberlain and how well that situation worked out, and try to draw that analogy. But I'm not really sure it works. I mean, I have friends who are certainly smart enough to know that, and they don't seem to care. So those are the sort of problems that are coming up. But again, I think we'll live through it, and I think the House will probably end up ousting Mike Johnson and come back to try to find another speaker, and it'll be more of a bipartisan. They don't have much of a majority anymore. Another Republican congressman has announced his retirement today.
And they've got one out from an automobile accident, and
Right.
he won't be back for a while. Hal
Okay.
Rogers is the representative from the car accident. He is in good condition.
Are these any of the no labels people who were willing to make any
No.
kind of negotiation, anything like that? No. Okay. Priscilla, what you were saying before about people wanting protection from the government, but then they don't want the government to do anything. I was thinking about an interview that I saw with a Trump supporter saying, "Oh, well, he's like a benevolent parent or something who's firm, clean up your room," and I'm thinking, how when a person doesn't even want the government to say wear a mask, and that's overreach. You want someone who's going to dictate to you, and you're going to be satisfied, and people don't rebel against their parents, and this is what you're asking for. Do you have any idea what you're actually asking for? I would love to be the interviewer, although they probably wouldn't want to talk to me, because some of these answers, they're beyond anything that makes sense. I am concerned also about a descent into fascism, and I can see it coming. Perhaps not this time around. I think a tremendous amount of apathy, as you said, Scott. People don't care, and I don't understand that. I really don't. With all the evidence from history, are we somehow magically immune? I mean, I guess people are going to have to experience it for themselves, and unfortunately, that means people who are younger are going to be around and have to deal with it a lot longer.
That's probably true.
Than we older folks.
Well, hopefully. I'm hoping Priscilla outlives me. I mean, I think the numbers are on her side. I'm just going to say that.
Fair.
Well,
doesn't mean I'll do it happily.
Well, I understand.
Yeah, no, I understand. I just and my grandchildren, I think, oh boy. So there has certainly been support in this country for fascism. And it seems to me, well, it probably never left, but it is certainly emerging to a greater extent, much more overtly than it was before. So Priscilla, you don't see Trump as being a part of this?
I wouldn't. So I think he is a character in a social play. I don't actually really see him as being a political influencer from that, but from the perspective of being a media puppet. You know, all he has to do is sponge up things he's hearing, spout it out on television. People are listening. He's established himself as a media presence. And so, you know, I don't think he's saying anything from the perspective of, say, you know, if we're going to, you know, bring Hitler into it, you know, Hitler at least had some original thought that he was writing and he was spewing. I don't know that Trump is spewing original thought. I think he's just repeating the stuff he's hearing through a really crappy filter. So he's not even necessarily putting the right information in his head that he's then spewing out. So, but I think he's probably more of a figurehead. I don't know that we yet have the true quote unquote quote fascist leader for the future of fascist America, but I do think Trump is a gateway drug.
Oh boy. And so somebody more intelligent than like a DeSantis or
no, stop.
You said intelligent.
You said intelligent. Just because no,
I did. No, I did.
Just because the guy went to law school at what, Yale? No, it does not mean, or wherever he went to. No, I'm sorry. He's not. No, I'm sorry. I agree with Priscilla. He is for the people that like to watch Honey Boo Boo. It is a reality show.
I've never seen Honey Boo Boo.
Well,
what is that?
I've seen it like 5 minutes and it's like stupid. But anyway, it's a reality show. And it's gone.
It's a reality show. It was a dance show, and she was this little girl at the time, maybe 6, and her mom was this like dance mom, and she was just this incredibly loquacious, precocious girl who she reflected a very specific demographic of American population. She's since grown up, and then she's like, yeah, I don't want to be seen that way anymore. However,
yeah,
it's now in the record. It's in the historical record, whether you want it to be or not.
Right.
So, go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Priscilla had made an interesting point there, and I think I somewhat agree that Donald Trump is he's not a person who's interested in ideology, and the filter that he has is really old. So when he says things like, they're releasing people from insane asylums and sending them over here, he seems to be talking about the Mariel boat lift that happened probably when he was cognizant at the time, was able to remember that, but doesn't remember that it happened in 1979, was one specific incident. And he seems to think that that's what they're doing now, which is obviously crazy. But he does facilitate some very, very ideological thinkers and gives them carte blanche to make policy decisions as long as he feels it will get him some adulation, which is really all he seeks. He just needs to feed his ego all the time because he's such a tiny little frightened person that he needs that. And as long as, so, you know, you could be talking about the worst people on earth, and we very often do. And he says, well, I don't really know them, but I know they like me, and that's fine with me. And that's all he seems to really care about, is he needs that adulation.
So on that note, I'd like to thank all of our participants, and we will see you again next time. So that's all the time we have for today's episode. The Nova Society is a production of the Phoenix Research Institute. We'd like to thank our sponsors for this episode. BH Conflict Resolution Services, a full-service dispute resolution firm offering expert and cost-effective mediation services to couples, groups, and businesses. BHCRS can be reached at www.bhcrs.com. We'd also like to thank our podcast partners, Buzzsprout, who hosts the Nova Society, Audacity, our editing partners, and Podkite, who does all of our analytics. iHeartRadio, where people get their music and podcasts, Apple iTunes, the largest source for music and podcasts on the internet, Spotify, the most popular source for the Nova Society. The Nova Society is available on all of these and other quality platforms. We'd like to thank all of our listeners. Without you, the Nova Society would not be possible. If you have a comment, question, or would like to be a guest on the Nova Society, we can be reached at nova.society.podcast@gmail.com. Always remember, the power of society is knowledge. So for Dr. Scott Gershworth, Dr. Priscilla Hobbs, Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, and all of us here at the Nova Society, I'm Dr. Mark Bound. Be well, and we hope to see you again next time.